Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and we are here today to talk about the Nobel Prize for Literature, which announced the 2024 laureate this morning as I am filming this video. And this is a very exciting announcement. I think they made a really interesting selection. I am feeling hopeful that it is a good sign for the Swedish Academy, which oversees the Nobel Prizes, that they are actually enacting a commitment that they made a while ago, because the laureate for 2024 is Han Kang, a South Korean writer. I've read one of her books, and we'll talk about that later on in the video. I will put timestamps in the description box down below because I think there are facets to the conversation that I want to have today. And if you want to navigate to different parts of them, I will let you do that with the timestamps down below. First, I want to talk about why this is potentially a very significant selection for the Swedish Academy and the Nobel Prize in general. Then we'll talk about Han Kang herself, and then we will talk about the works of Han Kang. And that will be an interesting conversation to have because I believe at this moment, only 4 of Han Kang's books have been translated into English, and there is a 5th on the way next year. I will have affiliate links to bookshop.org for the books that have been translated into English in the description box down below as well. I am willing to bet that you can place an order, but they might get back ordered. At least some of the titles will probably be back ordered if they aren't already. So you might have to wait a little while, but I will have those affiliate links in the description box down below. If I spark an interest in reading Han Kang's books, you could use those. Bookshop.org supports independent bookstores, and the affiliate links give me a little bit of a kickback. Otherwise, you can support your local independent bookstore. I'm wearing a t-shirt from Book People of Moscow, which is obviously a very beautiful store. You could also support your local library. And that's what it is. So if you want to navigate to different parts of the conversation, you can do that with the timestamps down below. I think it's important first to talk about why this is potentially such a significant selection. And in order to do that, I need to talk about 2 things that people get very upset when you talk about. I have done a reaction to the Nobel Prize for Literature every year since I have had a channel, starting in 2019, which was a very interesting year for the Nobel Prize for Literature. Since that came up, let's just talk about that one first. 2019 was significant because the Nobel Prize for Literature had to take a year off. And in 2019, they announced 2 laureates for literature, one for 2018, the year that they did not make an announcement, and one for 2019. And it was also an interesting year because one of those selections was very good, and one of those selections, I think, was very bad. And I had to turn the comment section on that video off because over time, trolls who really just wanted to come and defend the 2019 winner were finding that video and leaving very offensive comments on it. So I just, for my own mental health, turned the comment section off. The reason they had to take a year off is that there were internal problems. And again, I don't really want to get into what they were because that'll make this video unnecessarily long. But basically, they had to expel some members of the Swedish Academy. And according to their rules, they needed a certain amount of people in order to award a prize, and they didn't meet that criteria. And because they have such rigid processes for bringing new members in, they just would not have been able to do that before they could make an announcement for 2018. So they had to go through this process where they would bring new members in, and then in 2019, they were able to vote not just for 2019, but for 2018. And it was a big controversy at the time. I think a lot of people have forgotten about that already, which is why it's interesting to talk about that one first, because it was a big deal at the time, and there was a lot of scandal and controversy, and people were sort of questioning at the time whether or not the Nobel Prize could come back from that. I don't really think there was ever a question about that. But it was a big deal at the time, and it feels like people have sort of forgotten about it by now. So that's the first thing. And when I think about the Nobel Prize for Literature, it's not just the fact that starting in 2019, I started doing reactions to it. It's that it feels like post-2019 is the Nobel Prize as it currently exists. Like they had already had scandal, controversy, discourse going on, and then that internal problem that caused a lot of criticism of the organization made them take a year off. So I kind of think of them as something that starting in 2019 has been in a new era for the Nobel Prize for Literature. But the discourse that was happening before that controversy is that over the years, a lot of people started vocally talking about vocally talking. You know what I mean. Not the best grammar, but you get the point. Talking about how the majority of people who have won a Nobel Prize for Literature are white men from Europe or North America. And the Nobel Prize made a commitment. They made a statement saying, we're going to do better about recognizing people outside of Europe and North America. And in the years since they made that very public commitment to do better, they have still predominantly recognized European and North American authors. Now, before people start leaving angry comments, I do want to say, I think the winners in recent years have largely been good, aside from that 2019 winner. I think that was a terrible choice on their part. And I think it was made in part because since they were announcing two winners that year, I think they really thought that everybody would focus on Olga Tokarczuk as the 2018 winner and not so much on the 2019 winner. But it was a terrible, terrible decision because it's like after the discourse problem that they had had, after the structural problem that they had had, giving a prize to Peter Hanke was just, it was a bad decision because it gave them it was like giving yourself a black eye, essentially. Just not a good look. So they have recognized some people outside of North America and Europe. And I think in at least two of those cases, the overall implication is that even if you are from somewhere outside of North America or Europe, you really need to have a connection to Europe, because the 2017 laureate was Kazuo Ishiguro. Now, I absolutely think that Kazuo Ishiguro deserves a Nobel Prize for Literature, but it's a weird nod to recognizing people from other areas, because although Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Japan, he has lived in England since he was about 5 years old, and his entire writing career has happened living in England. And Abdulrazak Gurna, the 2021 laureate, was born in Tanzania, but he went to England as a refugee at about age 18. Now, that's a more fraught situation because as a refugee, it wasn't necessarily his choice. But again, the implication becomes, if you want to be considered for a Nobel Prize for Literature, you really need to live either in Europe or North America, because Abdulrazak Gurna's entire writing career took place after he moved to Europe. And other than that, there really hasn't been too much outside of that over the last 10 years. Svetlana Alexievich is Russian. And then you would have to go back to Mo Yan's win in 2012 for anyone else outside of Europe and North America. So there have only been three, and two out of those three have very big connections to Europe. One of the biggest angry comments I get when I have this discussion every year is something very reactionary. And before you leave angry comments, maybe just think about this, because the most common comment that I get as pushback for this discussion is that, well, listen, if white men are being recognized for this prize more than women or people of color or anything like that, maybe that's because they deserve it more. If writers from North America or Europe are being recognized more, maybe that's because they deserve it more. And it's always a little bit laughable to me, because when there has been an accusation of a structural problem that is giving white male or North American or European or both authors an advantage, the fact that predominantly white men or European or North American authors have won is not evidence that that's the way it should be. In fact, if anything, it's kind of evidence that there is, in fact, a bias for what is supposed to be a global prize. Because when you say that you are to recognize global literature, you really need to be able to recognize global literature and treat global literature on an even playing field. And if you are doing that, I get comments from people saying, like, well, if you're considering global literature and most of the winners are from Europe, then that just means European literature is good. Well, no, that just means that the European judges of this prize are having a very difficult time getting outside of their comfort zone or their realm or what they are familiar with. And it's up to the Swedish Academy to fix that and find ways to do that. And it's interesting. I had a conversation recently about the Pulitzer Prize and the challenges that it has had adapting, because I think when you look at these long-standing literature prizes, or any prize really, there's an interesting challenge, because the Pulitzer Prize is a very rigid institution, and so is the Swedish Academy. And you basically have to either find ways to evolve or stagnate. And I think both prizes have had some success stories and some successes in evolving, but they've also had some pretty bad problems seeming like they're becoming stale. And they need to meet the moment a little bit better. And because the Nobel Prize for Literature made this commitment to be better, it's nice to finally see them really take a meaningful step in that direction. Because again, Han Kang has published a lot of books and poetry collections, most of which have not been translated into English yet. And I don't know that people on the Swedish Academy are able to read the books that haven't been translated into English yet, but definitely they were able to recognize someone who has meaningful things to say and contribute that people would benefit from taking in. Because the Nobel Prize for Literature is a major literary prize, at least in the Western world, because it comes with a significant sales boost. It means that authors who win the Nobel Prize for Literature get significant marketing and publicity budgets attached to any books they might publish in the future. And for Han Kang, that is a huge deal. Han Kang is only 53. She is one of the youngest people to be recognized with the Nobel Prize for Literature. And for that reason, she has a long career being able to leverage the title of Nobel Prize laureate in the future. And that's great. It does apply significance and heft to an author's work. And it sends a signal to people like, this is an author that you should probably make an effort to get to know if you haven't already. We could have a whole conversation about whether or not that is a worthwhile pursuit or they should have this influence. But, if it helps people discover good literature, that's a good thing. The thing is, and I feel weird saying this because, again, the recent winners, I think, have been pretty solid. Jan Fosse, I read one of his books after he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Morning and Evening. I didn't love it, but I thought it was a really interesting book, and it is something that I have thought about in the almost year since I have read that book. And I can absolutely see why he was a worthy winner of the prize. Annie Ernaux, I went and read The Happening, and that is a nonfiction book. It's very short. I would definitely recommend that you take the time to read that book because it is tremendous. And I have absolutely wanted to read more of her books since she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, because The Happening, again, absolutely tremendous book. And I can't wait to read more of her work. Abdul Razak Gurnah. I haven't read any of his books yet, but I really want to. The one I would probably get to is Afterlives. Louise Gluck. I don't tend to read a lot of poetry, but given everything I have heard about her, she seems like an author I would really want to try at some point in the future. Olga Tokarczuk, absolutely an author that I would like to read, because I think I would probably go with Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead and start there, and then maybe think about some of her other books. And she is actually also fairly young. I think she was 56, somewhere around there, when she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So obviously she would be a little older now. But definitely an author that I would like to try. Kazuo Ishiguro was the 2017 winner. Oh, I love his books. So before that was Bob Dylan. I think you can quibble with that selection. And I absolutely think you can quibble with the 2019 selection of Peter Hanke. But other than that, there have been good winners. They just haven't been meeting the mandate that they set for themselves. Ignore my calendar. And that's a problem. And it's up to them to fix that. And I know that it would be difficult to do that. And I don't know what the answer is. Again, the Swedish Academy has very rigid processes for allowing people into the organization, and I think after 50 years, they release the notes and the nominees that were under consideration. But until that time period is over, you don't really get to know any insight into what the process was. Maybe they could have committees of people who know literature and global literature, that is, and allow them to make recommendations to the Swedish Academy that they should consider. Because I don't expect them to be experts at African literature, but they have to account for giving African authors equal weight to European authors. Because to my way of thinking, if everyone is on an even playing field, there will be more diversity in the winners because everyone's getting equal access. And another comment I frequently get is that, well, if they put themselves a mandate where they can only recognize people from other areas, which by the way is not what they're saying they're going to do. They're just saying they're going to do better to give equal weight. Then there will be a lot of worthy European and North American authors who won't get recognized. So what you're saying when you say that is that you think the current mode should stand, which is unfair to people from everywhere else. So you're saying it's okay to be unfair to the rest of the world, and we shouldn't be unfair to North America and Europe. And again, for a global prize, you should give equal weight and equal consideration. And hopefully this is a sign that that is something that they are going to do. And again, I can't necessarily fault the recent winners. I think Han Kang, excellent choice. Jan Fosse, excellent choice. Annie Ernaux, excellent choice. Like, I could go back again. I already did it. But they haven't really taken actionable steps toward recognizing their mandate. And I'm hoping that this award means that they are finally doing that. And that remains to be seen. We'll have to see who wins next year. And if a white man or a North American or a European author wins the Nobel Prize for Literature next year, it's not necessarily a sign that things are terrible and they're backsliding. But if we get, say, 4 or 5 North American or European winners in a row after this, it's not going to be great. So hopefully this means that they are actually taking steps toward doing better when it comes to their mandate. And we'll have to see. The main thing I think in talking about this, because people, again, get very upset about this conversation, is just that I think we as people who follow these prizes need to hold them accountable, especially when they say they're going to do something. We need to hold them accountable to say, if they're not doing it, we need to tell them, hey, you said you were going to do this and you haven't done it. So hopefully this is a good and positive step in that direction. Let's pivot to talk about Han Kang herself. She was born in South Korea in 1970. And in the next section, I'll talk specifically about her books that have been translated into English and what they are about. In this section, I'll talk about her career a little more broadly. So she is the daughter of a novelist, and she rose to prominence in the English-speaking world, at least, with the publication of The Vegetarian. Now, again, I'll talk about her books specifically in the next section. I just think the arc of her career in the English-speaking world is really interesting. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about in this section. The Vegetarian was published in English in 2015, translated by Deborah Smith. It was originally published in South Korea in 2007. It went on to win the International Booker Prize. I believe it was one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 Best Books of the Year as well. It was at least one of the 100 notable books for that year. Then following year, we got another English translation called Human Acts, also done by Deborah Smith. And that was released in English in 2016. It had originally been published in 2014. So since we got The Vegetarian in English, we've gotten a fair amount of Han Kang's recent works translated into English. She's actually been publishing since 1995. Her debut work was a novella called Love in Yeosu. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. I hope I did. That has not been translated into English. She has also released poetry collections, essays, and many of those early works have not been translated into English. So since The Vegetarian and Human Acts, the turnaround time for her releasing a book in South Korea and it being translated into English has begun to shrink. I'm willing to bet that since only a year passed between Human Acts and The Vegetarian, or vice versa, since The Vegetarian came first, they were probably working on a translation of Human Acts before The Vegetarian was released to such wide success. And it's only gotten better, or the turnaround time has only gotten shorter since then. Her next book after Human Acts was called The White Book, which sounds fascinating, by the way. It was originally published in 2016. We got the English translation in 2017. So again, only a year went past between them, whereas Human Acts, it was 2 years. Oddly, there has been a bit of time in her most recent book. She published We Do Not Part in 2021. We will be getting the English translation in 2025, early 2025. So that one would be a pre-order if you click the affiliate link down below. In between The White Book and We Do Not Part, we got Greek Lessons. It was published in English in 2023. I've heard great things about it. and it was originally published in 2011. It will be interesting to see if her publisher goes back and we get more translations going earlier into her career, or if we just kind of keep translating books as they are published now. I don't know which direction it will go, but it will be interesting to see what happens and how her career develops. I will say the book coming next year has different translators, Emily Yewon and Paige Ania Morris. Emily Yewon had co-translated Greek lessons with Deborah Smith. And I feel I should note, because translation is a very interesting topic. There have been criticisms from at least one person, an author and academic named Charsi Yoon, and again, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who had criticisms of the translation of The Vegetarian by Deborah Smith. I am going to read this from the Wikipedia page. In an article published in 2017, writer and academic Charsi Yoon reported on criticisms in the Korean media of the English translation of The Vegetarian because of its omissions, embellishments, and mistranslations. After reading the translation against the original, Yoon wonders, quote, "Did the translation take things too far? One distinguished translator told me he felt the context and style were so different that it was more reasonable to speak of Smith's work as an adaptation, not a translation," end quote. While Yoon calls the translation a stunning achievement, he acknowledges that for some readers who are familiar with the original, the translation has deviated so far that the disparity strains their eyes and ruins their enjoyment. Smith has defended her translation, stating, quote, "To say that my English translation of The Vegetarian is a completely different book from the Korean original is, of course, in one sense, entirely correct. Since there is no such thing as a fully literal translation, no two languages' grammars match, their vocabularies diverge, even punctuation has different weight, there can be no such thing as a translation that is not creative. And while most of us translators think of ourselves as faithful, definitions of faithfulness can differ. Because languages function differently, much of translation is about achieving a similar effect by different means. Not only are difference, change, and interpretation completely normal, but they are in fact an integral part of faithfulness," end quote. And then it notes that the author Han Kang has stood by Deborah Smith's translations. I think it's worth noting just because if you don't speak Korean, you do rely on these translations, and translation is a very interesting topic. I remember a long time ago when I was working at Borders, a coworker and I decided to read the same book at the same time. Obviously, now we would call that a buddy read. At the time, we just said, hey, let's read this book together. And I don't remember what the book was. What I do remember is that on a day when we were both working, we compared notes about the book so far, and she said, it's just so funny. And I looked at her like she was nuts, and she was like, what? And I was like, this book isn't funny. And she's like, yes, it is. So we realized she was reading a different translation than I was. So we compared 2 or 3 pages of her translation and mine, and her translation was funny. Mine was not. It was very enlightening because translating is a very difficult art. And I don't mean to say that we shouldn't trust translation, but it is a fascinating process. And part of me does sometimes wonder how well the translation captures the original book, or if it's just capturing the original book's intent. And I don't necessarily have an answer, but it's an interesting conversation to have. And since this is an author whose works have been translated into English, not written in English, it is a conversation that is worth having. I should also note the way that Han Kang was called out by the Swedish Academy. They awarded Han Kang, saying, "The Nobel Prize in Literature 2024 is awarded to the South Korean author Han Kang, quote, for her intense poetic prose that confronts historical traumas and exposes the fragility of human life," end quote. In her oeuvre, Han Kang confronts historical traumas. This is a quote, by the way. They just put that in quotation marks, so I felt like I needed to call it out. I'm still reading from their website. In her oeuvre, Han Kang confronts historical traumas and invisible sets of rules, and in each of her works exposes the fragility of human life. She has a unique awareness of the connections between body and soul, the living and the dead, and in her poetic and experimental style has become an innovator in contemporary prose. One of the reasons I think this is a really great choice for the Swedish Academy and for the Nobel Prize in general is that Han Kang doesn't necessarily feel like a Nobel Prize laureate, because I think when a lot of people think of Nobel Prize laureates, they think of like serious, weighty literature that can be a bit boring. And sometimes, if you want to read a lot of Nobel Prize laureates, it almost feels like being forced to eat your vegetables in a way. And that's not Han Kang. And to be fair, I don't think that's Annie Ernaux. It could be Jan Fosse a little bit. So they've kind of gotten away from some of that in recent years, but Han Kang feels like a bold step. She doesn't feel like a traditional Nobel Prize laureate, and yet she fits in very well. So it's sort of like a bold new step. She's just an interesting author to talk about. So let's start talking about her books that have been translated into English. I will link the Nobel Prizes page dedicated to Han Kang down below. I will also link a page that they put together as a sort of introduction to her works, where they say, are you curious about literature laureate Han Kang but unsure which of her books to pick up? And then they have some recommendations. So let's start with that. I'll link it down below as well. And the first book they want to talk about is The Vegetarian. Of course, it's her most known book. It's also the only book of hers that I have read. What they say is, The Vegetarian is Han Kang's international breakthrough novel, which won the International Booker Prize in 2016. It's the story of a middle-aged Korean woman who one night suddenly decides not to eat meat anymore. The vegetarian herself is silent in the novel. Her story is instead told in 3 different narratives by her husband, her brother-in-law, and her older sister, in that order. Their different reactions, from abhorrence to sexual fascination to poisonous envy, stand in sharp contrast to the woman's own mute refusal to back down or to admit to any guilt for the shame she has brought to her family. Through these responses, we get a sharp portrait of a patriarchal society obsessed by careerism and rigid, sometimes tyrannical, social norms and conventions. So, The Vegetarian, as I said, is the only one of her books that I have read. And I think one of the things that is most interesting about it is the fact that its subject, this woman, the titular vegetarian, never really speaks to the reader. Instead, you get these differing views of her. Almost Rashomon, but I don't want to go down that road. It's very interesting. What I will say, I think I had been very hyped for The Vegetarian because it won the Booker Prize International. I believe it was one of the New York Times top 10 books of the year. I just kept running into good reviews of it, and I was hyped to read it. And when I did, I had a very visceral reaction to it, to the point where, not right away, but I did trade the book in at my local used bookstore. And I regret that now, because since I read it, The Vegetarian has haunted me. And I think that's the intention. And it's only on reflection that I really appreciate that the visceral reaction I was having to The Vegetarian was kind of the point. And I'm a bit ashamed of that. It's kind of like reading Toni Morrison's Beloved, and then your only critique of the book is to say, wow, what an unpleasant reading experience. Well, yes, but the unpleasantness is the point. Toni Morrison was writing about enslavement and the traumas that come with enslavement and systemic structures of racism that persist. It's not supposed to be pleasant. I have a whole video about Beloved, by the way. I'll link it down below because I'm doing a Pulitzer Prize project where I read all of the books, and that is a Pulitzer Prize winner. Also, Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize laureate. And The Vegetarian is kind of the same thing. And that's where I think, even though Han Kang doesn't feel like a traditional Nobel Prize laureate, she fits right in, because I think The Vegetarian could stand beside Beloved. I think Beloved is a little better, but it definitely stands beside that book and fits in with it. And I think it's going to be very interesting to hear more reactions to The Vegetarian, because I've already heard from a bunch of people who are excited to read Han Kang now that she has won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and they haven't. I think a lot of people are gravitating toward The Vegetarian, which makes sense. It's her biggest book in English. And it will be interesting to see how it goes, because I think it is an unpleasant reading experience. But that's the point, and it's very successful at that. And it does make a lot of really interesting points. It's a book that has sat with me since I read it, and I'm kind of ashamed of that visceral reaction I had sort of against it when I initially read it, because I do think it is a tremendous book. I think it has a lot to say, and it's fascinating. And I have been thinking about reading another of Han Kang's books ever since I started this process of reevaluating The Vegetarian, since I initially read it. The one that I have most considered reading is actually the next book on their list, which is Greek Lessons. Here's what they say. This short but intense and psychologically penetrating novel is an intimate portrait of two individuals who have lost, or are in the process of losing, the most vital links that connect them to the exterior world. After having suffered domestic abuse, the female protagonist has retreated into muteness, while the male protagonist slowly is losing his sight due to a hereditary disease. In order to regain an ability to communicate, the woman is taking courses in ancient Greek, since a language not longer spoken will not be able to hurt her, while the man losing his sight is her Greek teacher. A delicate love story of sorts, the novel traces their attempt to, if not overcome, at least try to find common ground in their shared bereavement. It's also a book about language and how words can help us give shape and meaning to our outer and inner world, but also tear it and destroy what is most delicate in all of us, our identity. It sounds really interesting. And I think one thing I would look for in revisiting Han Kang is probably, like, The Vegetarian is, as I said, visceral and has a lot of violent imagery and occurrences in the book. And I feel like I might, because I can be a bit squeamish, maybe I would avoid that. In Greek Lessons, it's described as intense and psychologically penetrating, so I don't think you fully get away from that, but it feels like a bit of a softer access point, so that might be the one that I go with. The most obvious one probably would be Human Acts, but I think I would go with Greek Lessons. And Human Acts is actually the only other book they mention on their recommendations from the Nobel Prize website. Human Acts. As in her latest novel, We Do Not Part, scheduled for publication in English in January of 2025, Human Acts takes an oblique but terrifying and totally convincing look at her country's not-so-distant past. Through many different ever-shifting perspectives, which create an almost unbearable narrative suspense, the novel chronicles the lives of many people either taking part or as victims innocently being caught up in a student uprising in May 1980 in the town of Gwangju, where the author spent her childhood and early youth, an uprising that was brutally crushed by the then ruling military junta. As in many of her other works, the border between perpetrator and victim, body and soul, or even between living and dead, is fluctuating, which is reflected in a language both straightforward and subtle. Han gives in this and several other novels a new meaning to the expression living with the past, considered as remnants of a reality that you can neither shy away from nor resist. Through her honest and truly awe-inspiring literary works, we live and relive our pasts continuously. And again, that one sounds really interesting. One book that they don't call out that I thought sounded interesting, and I know actually in a conversation with Jen the Librarian on Instagram, she said that the one she wants to try most is The White Book, which was also, I believe, translated by Deborah Smith. Here's the description of that on bookshop.org. While on a writer's residency, a nameless narrator focuses on the color white to creatively channel her inner pain. Through lyrical, interconnected stories, she grapples with the tragedy that has haunted her family, attempting to make sense of her older sister's death using the color white. From trying to imagine her mother's first time producing breast milk to watching the snow fall and meditating on the impermanence of life, she weaves a poignant, heartfelt story of the omnipresence of grief and the ways we perceive the world around us. In captivating, starkly beautiful language, The White Book offers a multi-layered exploration of color and its absence, of the tenacity and fragility of the human spirit, and of our attempts to graft new life from the ashes of destruction. And as I think about it, I might even prioritize that one over Greek Lessons in thinking about Han Kang books to read, because it just sounds fascinating. To sum this all up, if you skipped over to a separate section about Han Kang, the Nobel Prize for Literature made a commitment publicly to being better at recognizing global authors. Not just Europeans, not just North Americans, not just white men. And they've been very hit or miss in executing that commitment that they made. Recognizing Han Kang feels like a good step in the right direction. I think it's an excellent choice. I think Han Kang is worthy of a Nobel Prize for Literature based on my experience with The Vegetarian. Hopefully, this is a sign that the Swedish Academy is finally taking their own mandate seriously. And hopefully we'll see more choices like this in the future. I mean, the thing is, as I said, the recent Nobel laureates are pretty inarguable. I think Jan Fosse, solid choice. Annie Ernaux, solid choice. Abdul Razak Gurna, Louise Gluck, Olga Tokarczuk, Kazuo Ishiguro. These are excellent choices. I might quibble with some of the other recent ones, but they feel pretty inarguable. But a global literature prize shouldn't just be looking at people who live in Europe or North America. So I'm glad that we're finally getting out of that, because there are plenty of authors in Asia, in Australia, in Africa, in South America, who are also extremely worthy of the prize and have not been recognized or given equal weight. So hopefully this is a sign that that is going to start happening. And I'm very excited for Han Kang. I'm excited to read more of her work other than just The Vegetarian. I am excited to hear how other people react to this choice and what they think of her work when they begin reading it. I feel like I should stress her work is difficult. As I said, I had a visceral reaction to The Vegetarian when I read it. But over time, I have really come to appreciate what that book does. And for that reason, I think this is an excellent choice. And we will see in coming years if the Nobel Prize for Literature continues moving in this direction. It feels like an audacious choice, and I celebrate that. So there you are. That's the Nobel Prize for Literature 2024. Let me know what you think of this prize, what you think of this selection in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.